Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. These books are available free for viewing online at www.philosophypublishing.com. Along with me are our panelists and discussants, Professor Mark Brennan. Mark is a professor at the Stern School of Business at New York University. He's also the American editor of the Quarterly Review of London, established 1809. And Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale, has an MBA from Wharton, an MA from Tufts. Rick is an independent investor and is presently in the venture capital business. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of concepts in current media and compare the essence of the concept with the usage and circumstances in which they're being used. This week, we're going to discuss all the rage in the news right now, which is the government shutdown caused by the inability of Congress to negotiate or come to terms with the Senate and the President on the continuing resolution and raising the budget. So the House of Representatives, with its conservative group, has certain things it wants to negotiate, and the other side will not come to the table. So we're going to discuss whether it has any significance at all to the American economy. Does a government shutdown have any significance at all? For example, you're outside since the government has been shut down, and the cars are going by, people are going to work, grocery stores are stocked with food, everything's still happening, but everybody cries out what a terrible thing this is. Well, is it? And does the government have so much influence that it can have a deleterious effect on the economy? Let's explore this subject. First, the U.S. government is about, in total dollars, I believe, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, if I've got any of these facts wrong, they're just approximations, but I believe the U.S. government has about 20% of the economy, in the sense that it spends about 18-20% of the GDP. So let's note that there's 20% of spending, but it takes all these most of the spending and goes through the agencies in entitlement programs, and of course it also has money involved in the Defense Department. But most of the agencies in entitlements going off in the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, the EPA with all its regulations, and so on and so forth. There's many, many departments within their government. And we note that when $1 is spent, for example, in welfare, in an entitlement program, only less than 20% of it reaches the actual end user. Actually, I think I've heard and read that it's actually around 10 or 15%. But we'll give it the benefit of the doubt here and call it 20%. So if the government takes in $1 and it spends it, say, gives it to a welfare recipient, only about less than 20% actually gets to the end user. So we're going to note that, 20%. So its inefficiency rating is about 80%. We also should note that a shutdown is not really a shutdown. It's only a partial shutdown, in the sense that on a cash basis, the government remains about 80% open, in the sense that it's got a day-to-day intake of money that's about 80% of its budget. So when they say it's shut down, it really only means about 20%. So let's take that and note that. So it's actually 20% of 20%. So actually comes into the economy. So it's got an 80% inefficiency charge, so 20% of the dollar comes into the end user, and it's 20% of its budget. So really only the effect is 20% of 20%, which is 5%. Is that right? 4% actually, I guess. And 20% of 4%, what's that, guys? Somewhere around 1.8. So really less than 1% of the total effect of the economy is really coming from the government, as I make these calculations. So our GDP is a little bit over 2%, and we subtract that, really, which is less than 1%. So our net is greater than 1%, still positive, even with what they call a government shutdown. So I don't see that the government is really going to affect any of this at all, except that I think it's a great exercise because its ineffectual ability to affect the economy, yet it's so much of spending, 20%. So I think it's a great thing to happen, is this partial shutdown. What do you guys think? Good or bad?
I think it sets the stage for the ongoing debate highlighted a few days ago by Holman Jenkins in the Wall Street Journal that ultimately has to address how we control the growth in entitlement spending. There have been numerous shutdowns, partial shutdowns over the years. This is all part of the political theater found in Washington. So, that it's come to this is no great surprise. What remains unaddressed, utterly unaddressed by either party, and certainly not by the president, who seems to have no interest in the growth in long-term entitlement spending, is, what do you do about Social Security? What do you do about Medicare? What do you do about the added expense of Obamacare? These huge entitlement costs that are simply not sustainable, and I'm obviously not the first person to point that out. So, the more shutdowns, the better, to the extent that it focuses the minds of our politicians on that crucial debate.
Okay. Mark, any comment, opening comment?
I just agree with Rick that the lack of discussion or even bringing it up as a topic in terms of entitlements is just nauseating, and it just kind of confirms my thesis that the baby boomers are the most despicable generation in the history of the United States. First generation to inherit the country and leave it to its offspring in worse shape than when it received it, and you can blame 99.9% of this on the self-absorbed, anything at all, regardless of cost, gimme baby boomers. They're disgusting.
Okay, so what do you think? Let's say this thing takes off and it's a deadlock, and the partial government shutdown continues for a long time. Let's say for a year. Let's say right up till the next election in 2014. In the intervening time, what do you suppose would happen to the economy? Anything?
Well, something would happen to the economy, Chris, but it would be a lot less harmful than what's going to happen if we don't eventually take our medicine. We're talking about cataclysm and just completely going off the cliff. It's one thing when we decide how much money we can borrow. It's another thing when the bond market decides how much money we can borrow and shuts us out. And when that happens, party's over. The baby boomers can all go home and start crying because there will be no entitlements for anyone when we can't finance this anymore. And at some point, a rational person has to stand up. I think Rand Paul finally did and said, if we're not bringing any more revenues in and expenses are growing, this can't go on forever. We might as well stop the party now and start making some kind of an effort to rectify this.
Well, as I listen to you, you've really pointed out that on one side of the equation is a chasmalytic. What did you say? Chasma. What was the word you used?
Cataclysm.
Oh, right. So a huge effect on one side, and the other side is the small effect of a possible partial government shutdown, whatever that might add into the effect onto the economy. So really, it's kind of a no-brainer as I see it. This is much better than going on with a continuing resolution and raising the debt ceiling and expanding the government even further. Do I read this correctly?
Yeah, I mean, the only problem is that Americans, in terms of intertemporal consumption patterns, insist on everything today. They have hyperbolic discount rates, and they can't look out and see that this is going to be a bigger problem in the future. And our Congress is arranged in such a way that these guys are only looking at 2 years, and now, a year and a half? They're not looking at this as a multi-decade problem to fix, and these clowns are trying to get it done overnight. It's not going to happen. It's going to get worse. And when the bond market shuts us out, then we really have problems.
You said the bond market shows us that?
When the bond market shuts us out, when China stops buying our bonds, when Japan stops buying our bonds, when you and I stop buying U.S. government bonds and rates skyrocket, watch out. And then the dollar becomes worthless, watch out.
And you're suggesting that we'll not be able to pay, they'll stop buying the bonds because we'll not be able to pay the interest on it, because it'll become...
We won't be able to pay anything on it. It would eventually get to a point where you say, you know what, that's too much debt.
In other words, we'll become like Greece.
Yeah, we'll become like Puerto Rico is probably a better example.
Right, I guess that's the next, that's just down the line too. Rick, what do you think about Mark's statement?
I think, broadly, it's very difficult to challenge that assessment. But we have, at a practical level, we have 3 years left in the Obama administration, and it's pretty clear that this president is not going to present any credible plan for tackling this issue. And what I mean is the runaway entitlement spending. He, philosophically, ideologically, he's on the side actually of doing the opposite and providing more entitlements. And Obamacare is exhibit number 1 in that regard. So I think it's actually a question of political responsibility on the part of other politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, to just keep turning up the heat. Because even if Obama squeaks through and there is no financial crisis of the type Mark is describing, and that is possible, it's likely that it will be the next president that will have to deal with the crisis. And the sooner the heat can be turned up, and the sooner incremental changes can be made to at least some of the entitlement spending, the less cataclysmic or catastrophic the end result will be.
Okay.
Chris, can I just add, we're blaming Obama for a lot of this stuff, but let us never forget his big government spending idiotic predecessor who put 2 enormous wars on the national credit card, refused to raise taxes to pay for them, and expanded the entitlement state, the welfare state, more than any president had done since Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the king of that stuff, with Bush's Schedule D prescription drug benefit. So let us never forget that both parties are completely corrupt, and I would actually say that a false friend is worse than a traitor. When Bush tells us compassionate conservative, blah, 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 a false friend is worse than an enemy. I'm sorry, a traitor is worse than an enemy. A false friend is worse than an enemy. George W. Bush, who ran as conservative, spent like Obama did, and for that reason is more despicable.
Well, okay, history notes, as you have pointed out here, that both sides are responsible for the big spending programs, and really in modern history they really begin with Lyndon Baines Johnson, as you pointed out. But we need to come back to the present point about the Republicans versus the Democrats in the present showdown, because it's the future we're all concerned about. So we have here a situation where the Republicans are trying to put the brakes on spending, at least it appears that way.
On defense spending?
No, on spending altogether with the...
Not altogether. They just don't want to give money to the Democrats' constituents, and the Democrats don't want to give money to the Republicans' constituents. When you net it all out, there's no cut in spending, because neither of them are talking about entitlements.
Well, they are trying to force a discussion and bring the parties to the table so that there is a discussion begins about the coming debt crisis. So there is a present standoff regarding this matter in Congress, and presently, the conservative wing of the Republican Party is pressing for at least a discussion and some sort of resolution without giving a blanket raising of the debt and allowing the continuing budget resolution to go forth. So we have to ask the question: what do they have in mind? Particularly the Democrats. Why do they want to push the pedal to the metal on spending and don't want to negotiate and just get a clean resolution and raise the debt ceiling and pretend its life has never doesn't have any problems to present? What's in their mind? Rick, do you have any suggestion to this?
Well, it's certainly inconceivable that there's a political angle to this, bearing in mind the prior experience Democrats and Republicans had when they tried to shut Clinton's government down, and the Republicans were largely blamed for that. This is, as I said before, it's political theater, and the Democrats are betting, and it's probably a reasonable bet, that the Republicans will share most of the blame, and that going into the 2014 election cycle, they may get some lift and gain some seats back in the House of Representatives. Probably a reasonable approach if you're, partisan.
Yeah, Chris, I couldn't agree more. And to just further dispute your point, there was recently a vote in Congress. It was 417-0. Nobody voted against it, to provide all the back pay to every furloughed federal worker. So every Republican voted for that. So when we keep talking about Republicans cutting expenses, honestly, we got to look at their actions, not the hot air that comes out of their mouths. 417-0.
That's quite
Republicans are
remarkable.
pushing for furloughed workers to get all their back pay. You tell me how that cuts expenses.
Right. Good point.
I think the sooner we dismiss this party as nothing but a lot of hot air who are working in collusion with the Democrats to just screw the country, the sooner we'll all just wake up and do what we got to do.
Okay, so let's go back to our original point. Let's say the conservatives hang in there and say without concessions on spending, we're not agreeing to anything, we're not raising the debt limit, we're blocking the continuing resolution. If that were to happen, the effect, how would the United States survive? Can it survive with a sudden drop of 20% of its government and still be okay? What does 20% mean?
Well, look, I mean, there are two issues here. There's the temporary government shutdown, and it looks as if that could be temporarily resolved today. There is somewhat separately the issue of raising the debt ceiling and the possibility, however remote, that the government would default. That a default is, even if it's a temporary one, it would raise the cost of servicing current government debt, and that's real money. I'd have to estimate, based on prior experience, how much it would go up. Not nearly as much as some of the smaller countries like Greece and Ireland and so forth that have been through this sort of crisis, but that would potentially be a real cost that would fall away over time as the creditworthiness of the United States was reestablished. But it's certainly not a desirable outcome, and that's why I don't think it's going to happen. But this kind of temporary shutdown in government services, I think will be forgotten in a month's time, and I think the impact on an already weak economy will simply not be that significant. It's not going to change corporate minds one way or the other as to whether they decide to invest more or less on a 2 to 5 year basis. I mean, that's just not what corporations are attuned to, and they're the ones that decide whether to hire people and build out their businesses and drive economic growth forward.
Right. Now that brings really to the forefront here of the discussion. Interest rates. The Fed is keeping interest rates down. But can they keep it down all by themselves, or will the market force it to get a higher interest rate on its, for example, the interest on the bonds? And should that happen, would that affect the economy going forward?
Yes. In a word, yes. We saw that played out at the end of the summer, early fall, when there was discussion of tapering that never happened. Interest rates rose. The housing market showed signs of cooling. There's a direct effect. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, but the Fed probably is going to try and keep interest rates down clearly through 2014. Does that bring to the horizon a question about inflation and an effect on the economy all by itself? Either keeping interest rates down seems to might have a deleterious effect, and raising of interest rates may have a adverse effect against the economy. Almost seems like either way you go, it could have a negative effect on the economy. What do you think?
Well, look, with Janet Yellen being appointed the new head of the Federal Reserve, there's little possibility that tapering will occur in its extreme form anytime soon. I mean, she's known to be one of the most dovish policymakers of the Federal Reserve, so it will be untapered for longer, not forever, but for longer. The IMF, incidentally, just lowered the world growth forecast yet again. So the growth driver for interest rates worldwide is not very strong, and there are signs that it's going to remain weak for some time to come. So at the margin, if the United States were to really do something dumb like default on its interest payments, I would suspect it would be a relatively temporary effect, but interest rates would rise for a period of time relative to where they are.
Mm-hmm. Could the partial government shutdown affect interest rates? Let me give you
what the stock market is telling us.
let me give you a scenario. The bond market feels that the government may reprioritize its payments of its obligations. And what would be the possibility of that actually happening? I actually think that Obama threatened that the other day on an interview, looking to cause the market to implode, which would cause the conservatives to do as he wishes. What do you think?
Well, Mr. Obama says a lot of things, right? Some of them are true. I would
Like
chalk
what?
that all up to political theater. Whether he's actually going to follow through with it is, I think, remote.
So you don't think a reordering of the priorities of government is really would happen, that they would pay their obligations without any hesitation, without any as they have been?
Well, I think as much as Mr. Obama would like to imagine himself as kind of an emperor figure, I don't think with a stroke of the pen he's entitled to reorder the prioritization of payments on the various obligations of the United States government. I don't think that's in his job remit.
Well,
Rick, I didn't think that rewriting the bankruptcy laws was in his job remit either, and that was apparently.
Right, exactly. He's done several things that.
You know, as a
outside-
historian, the one thing I've learned from studying history is never rule out anything. Anything is possible. Absolutely anything. And with this guy, the possible is just something that you will fear and dread.
Right. Okay. Guys, I want to thank you for joining us here on the Philosophical Angle, as you have many times in the past. And we'd like to see you next week. Thanks for joining us.